In 1962, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Engel versus Vitale. What happened in the case is the New York State Board of Regents approved a non-denominational voluntary prayer that students could say each day in class. A number of organizations challenged that on First Amendment grounds that it constituted a state establishment of religion. In fact, the court majority decided that this type of prayer, even though non-denominational, even though voluntary, could not be used, and in fact, this is the so-called school prayer decision. It does show that the court tends to decide most all cases on the narrowest grounds possible, and they were not deciding that America should not be a religious nation. Every child in America in a public school is free to pray all day long as they want, as long as they're attentive to their lessons as well. So it is an important case, but one that needs to be read in context and needs to be read very carefully. And if you're interested in this case, you want to go ahead and see what other cases have been decided since. Now, there are some denominations of faith that are very much opposed to war. Quakers, for example, are opposed to war. Sergeant Alvin York, as I talked about before, was a conscientious objector who eventually accepted the role as a fighter, and he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor in World War I. But it's important to know that while some may not have doctrine as firm as we may in the Catholic faith, they do have beliefs that are overriding, and some oppose war. The Trinity Broadcast Network is the world's largest religious network, and it features all sorts of persons and personalities 24 hours a day. And if you look at it, it looks more like some commercial-free inspirational programming. And they have children's programs, and they have all sorts of programming. It would be interesting for you to go to TBN. Joel Osteen and Paula White-Cain are two of the pastor personalities who appear on TBN. It is part of the tools of the televangelists. They must get to as many people as they can, and it's a way of making church beyond a physical building. Now, speaking of physical buildings and churches, Aimee Semple McPherson was one of the first females who was in preaching and who took to the radio. She was granted a radio license in 1924 and was very successful at it and reached large audiences. And she created her Foursquare Gospel Church out there in California that is still, as far as I know, going, despite the fact that she died many years ago. She was the character, the basis for which Sister Sarah was written by Elmer Gantry, or in the book Elmer Gantry, and then the film by Sinclair Lewis. Modern preachers rely on the Bible, they rely on the spiritual needs of the flock, but they also look to reach them however they may. Father Charles Coughlin, we talked about, began his radio broadcast in 1926, and he got 80,000 letters every week by the time the 1930s came. 80,000 letters. This is not people liking him on social media. This is not people sending or re-sharing his tweets. This is 80,000 people sitting down and writing Charles Coughlin a letter. That is an amazing response to his audience, by his audience. Now, speaking of amazing responses, Billy Graham's website says that he preached the gospel to more people in live audiences than anyone else in history. And certainly he did. 215 million people in 185 countries and territories. He conducted his Billy Graham crusades all over the world. Here was a young man from Wheaton, Illinois, a Chicago suburb to the west, who was downtown with a friend of his, and they went to the Pacific Garden Mission. I've been past the place many times. And Mordecai Ham was a very famous evangelist of the day, and he was the one who led Billy Graham to Christ. Billy Graham found Christ, and by the time the war was over, he was into tent crusades. William Randolph Hearst, the very famous publisher, took a liking to Billy Graham, and he told his papers, promote Billy Graham, which they did. Imagine this. He had a tent crusade that lasted for more than 8 weeks. In 1957, when he went to Madison Square Garden, more than 16 weeks. The garden was full every single night to listen to Billy Graham preach. 1950, he founded his Evangelistic Association, which is still in existence. He wrote all these books. He was pastor to many presidents, although President Truman was the one who conspicuously said he didn't like him much. Truman was a devoted Baptist. Billy Graham died just about a year and a half, 2 years ago, in 2018 at age 99. Billy Graham, an important evangelistic voice in America's 20th century. Now again, back to some of these Protestant denominations. Some of them enact the social gospel in particular ways. Methodists, for example, were working in Libya to reduce landmines and other dangerous ordinances. The Presbyterian Church affirms nonviolence is a way of life and a tactical method for the followers of Jesus. And certainly if you look at the Gospels, you can see where this nonviolence would lead them to this conclusion and to this way of life. It is always fascinating to me how some denominations choose to focus on doctrine and others choose to enact it in a particular way, as in the nonviolent way. Some denominations look to feed the hungry and serve in foreign missions. Certainly the Mormons have a requirement that everyone must serve to mission during their lives. Now these are the famous words that I will read and repeat now from John Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961. Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. To me, these words from Kennedy's inaugural are a great summary about the difference and the distinctions between the state and the church. Those who serve in public office, those who serve in nonprofit agencies, non-governmental organizations, if they choose to adopt the Word of God as a motivating factor in their lives, should do so. And they can do so inside the Supreme Court, inside the White House, inside the Congress, but it doesn't have to be, he said, so much with a particular theology or a particular denomination in mind. It's God's work on earth must be our own. I thought this is a great summary. Here we look at some of the presidents of the 20th century, and I ask the question, which you aren't able to answer on this particular recording: did the faith of any of these presidents seem to make a difference? Woodrow Wilson was a Presbyterian. Richard Nixon was a Quaker. Harry Truman was a Baptist, I mentioned. Also was Jimmy Carter a Baptist. And I think that Bill Clinton was as well. And of course John Kennedy was a Catholic. Each in their own way, I suppose, lived their lives informed by their faith and guided by it. Some could speak quite eloquently about the faith, Carter and Clinton especially, and Harry Truman as well. They were great students of the Bible, and I'm not sure about the others. Dwight Eisenhower was not so much given to public displays like that, nor was Lyndon Johnson. But each of them in their own ways, I think, should be judged not on biblical match, but on how they lived and how they enacted God's work on earth. We haven't even talked really about the Eastern religions. Those too are here in America and have an impact. So I invite you to read my little handout entitled Pray, Vote, Shop. I suggest in it that Americans are devoted to religion, democracy, and capitalism with some interesting parallels. Read this provocative material, and when you see it on the syllabus, be prepared to talk. I pose these 3 questions in closing. How strong is America's faith? What have Americans done to live the faith? Finally, how have the men and women of God helped Americans embrace and enact their faith? These, to me, are the important questions, not which denomination, which church do you attend on Saturday or Sunday. It's how does faith motivate and guide what we do, one for the other. American Preachers and Their Versions of the Gospel, Module 6.